امل نزال. حتى اقول لك شو بدي اقول لك بعدين انت اعمل له ديليت اذا ما زبط. احكي
اللي بدك.
اوكي هلا كوني انا عم بتسجل
The Palestinians are the present-day victims of 1,000 years of Christian, European, and anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. That's how it is.
But this guilt, Christian, white, European guilt, should have nothing to do with Palestinians.
It's about a people who, through no fault of their own, were dispossessed and their land taken from them, with Western support, with Western assistance during that period.
Well, I mean, the reason I'm making this documentary is because I'm just sick and tired of what's happening to the Palestinian people.
Yeah,
and
so am I.
Growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, I was introduced to a certain view of the Palestinian history. But then, when I first started visiting my dad in London in the late 70s, I would be shocked at a completely different view of the same issues. Till this day, I still get baffled to see a certain logic being applied, a logic that the Westerner would certainly not use on any other issue. For example, the idea that Jews are entitled to go back to where they were exiled from 3,000 years ago. I mean, if we were to reshuffle the world according to expulsions not 3,000 years, but only 300 years ago, how would the world look like today? Hi, my name is Sami Muqaddim, originally from Lebanon and living in Ireland for the past 26 years. By profession, I'm a psychologist with no experience in filmmaking whatsoever. I simply got tired of Western mainstream media presenting the Palestinian-Israeli issues as being complex, historical, or religious, when I think it's none of those things. So, the purpose of this documentary is to disentangle the main issues and present them in the simplest, clearest ways possible. Now, I think all documentaries have an agenda, especially ones that pretend not to have one. So to be clear, the agenda of this documentary is human rights and equality. It's quite a condensed film, so I'm setting up a website where you can view more extensive interviews and have links to other websites. Beyond that, this is a self-funded project with no affiliations to any religious, political, or media groups.
The Palestine issue is about one very easy to understand fundamental fact. It's about dispossession, meaning that an alien people came and took the homes and possessions of the Palestinians and expelled them. That, in essence, is the whole conflict, the whole reason for the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, most Europeans think that Zionism came about because of the Holocaust. I mean, that's complete nonsense. Zionism is a colonial enterprise, and it was formally launched in 1897.
Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jew born in 1860, is commonly credited with being the father of Zionism. Zionism is an idea which basically says that Jews need an exclusive Jewish state. This idea came about as a reaction to European and Russian anti-Semitism. Zionism was formally launched in 1897. Once they decided where this state was going to be, Palestine, they started to migrate Jews there. At the onset of the century, the region was under Ottoman rule, and later on under British rule, and so the Zionists found their way into British politics to facilitate this plan. For example, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Originally in 1882, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 3%. Through migrations, by 1917, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 10%. By 1947, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 30%. In 1947, UN recommended the partitioning of Palestine. Arabs who owned about 92% of the land, with a population of 70%, were offered 43% of the land. Jews who owned 8% of the land, with a population of 30%, were offered 57% of the land. Arabs refused. A year later, in 1948, Israel declared itself a state on 78% of original Palestine. It did this through massacres, expulsion orders, and fear tactics, destroying more than 400 villages, making more than 700,000 refugees who fled to Gaza, West Bank, and neighboring Arab countries. 150,000 Palestinians remained inside the new state of Israel. In 1967, Israel exerted full control on the remaining 22% of Palestine.
In my view, there is one key to almost complete understanding, and that is knowledge of the difference between Judaism and Zionism. So let's look at them separately. Judaism is the religion of Jews, not the Jews, because not all Jews are religious. And like Christianity and Islam, Judaism has at its core a set of moral values and ethical principles. What is Zionism? Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism. It's a colonial enterprise which created a state for some Jews in the Arab heartland, mainly by terrorism and ethnic cleansing. And in so doing, it made a mockery of Judaism's moral values and ethical principles. In reality, Judaism and Zionism are total opposites.
I would say that with the coming of the second wave of Zionist settlers in 1905, came the group that developed the ideas that would later form the basis for all Zionist and Israeli strategies. They came with the idea that this is now the place where all the Jews have to come to. And this is the place that has to be exclusively Jewish. And it's quite amazing in a way, because they were themselves about sort of 3% of the population, and yet they regarded the other 97% as irrelevant to what's going on.
Zionism, when it came into being, it was very much a minority. Most Jews in the world, from Zionism's launch in 1897 until the obscenity of the Holocaust, most Jews in the world were opposed to Zionism. They believed it would lead to unending conflict with the Arabs. They knew it was morally wrong, and they also feared, and this fear is coming true day by day, that if Zionism was allowed by the major powers to have its way, it would one day provoke anti-Semitism.
The leaders of the movement were seeking a territory and were not focused on Palestine. You know, they had several options: Uganda, Argentina, and they discussed them very seriously. People forget it. You need to be an historian to remember these things. Uganda was, in the eyes of the founding father of the Zionist movement, Hwcstpip, a much better option than Palestine at a given moment.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
So he did consider it. I know it was offered.
No, he was in favor of Uganda. He was in favor of it.
The British, in a sense, started the whole thing, started the whole catastrophe, set it in motion with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which supported the establishment of a Jewish entity in Arab Palestine. Now, leave aside the fact that Britain had no right to give away what it didn't possess. The fact of the matter is, there were a number of reasons for that declaration.
The Balfour Declaration, it promised the Jews a homeland in the British Empire. It didn't promise them a state or independence. It was a homeland. The Balfour Declaration was written by the Zionist organisation for the British government. There was dialogue going on between the Zionists and the British government.
It is true that the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to partition Palestine into two states, one for the Arabs, one for the Jews, excluding Jerusalem because everybody knew that was too dangerous, that was to be excluded. Leave aside the fact that the United Nations didn't have the authority to partition Palestine. The issue of what to do about Palestine after Britain walked away, Britain made a mess of it and walked away, driven out by Zionist terrorism. So Truman then sent his people to the UN to make a new proposal. It was that it should become some kind of UN trusteeship. So the point really is this: there was no UN resolution for Israel. It was vitiated, became invalid, and it was while the General Assembly was again voting what to do that Israel unilaterally declared itself to be in existence. That's the truth of the matter. Israel was not given a birth certificate. It has no legitimacy whatsoever.
What really made it happen was the Holocaust, because of course this was something very appealing to the European conscience. People felt that Jews had to have a refuge, and they had to assist them, and so on. Now, of course, the irony here is, if they felt so strongly about it, why didn't these Europeans give Jews refuge in their own countries? And of course, they didn't want to, not in my backyard. It's an extremely skillful, clever fabrication by a very sophisticated Zionist propaganda machine, which created this idea. Of course, it's nonsense.
I mean, there is no link at all, as far as I understand, I mean, genetically speaking, between the Jewish people now living in Palestine and those who left it in antiquity.
The people who came and took over Palestine were Europeans, East Europeans most often, Poles, Lithuanians, Russians. These are people with their own history of conversion from their own religions to Judaism, and then they began to believe themselves to be the Jews connected to the ancient Israelites, and of course that's nonsense.
Okay.
One of the myths of Zionism is that there's always been tension and conflict in Israel-Palestine, or that the tension between Isaac and Ishmael has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, as if conflict between Jews and Arabs is inevitable. And we know that's not true.
It's so hypocritical now when you hear people say, Zionists say, that the Muslims are anti-Semitic. I'm going to come to that, because really, when you look back, the most horrific anti-Semitism has been in Europe. And when there was severe persecution in Europe, typically places of refuge were in Muslim lands.
Over the years, I have met so many well-meaning Westerners who felt they didn't know enough to take a stand. As I started making this film, I kept on getting more and more books, especially ones written by those I was interviewing. I kept on reading while asking myself, how much does one need to know before taking a stand? Eventually, I came to the conclusion that I needed to know less, not more, and just explain the basics and let them speak for themselves.
When I look back on it, I remember the very first time I went to Gaza, a grandmother who had been there pointing to an open sewer. And then I went back this time, nearly 20 years later, and everything had got worse.
Gaza is an incredible laboratory from Israel's point of view. It's a very small space with a very large number of people, 1.5 million Palestinians trapped into a tiny area on the coast. Israel has fenced them in, is now controlling the sea so they can't get in or out that way, controls the air, surrounds them on all sides. You know, I can't think of another situation in the world where one country has been able to so completely imprison another.
You know, Gaza, I was born in Gaza, I know Gaza. Prison is a very soft word. It is worse than prison. I wish Gaza is a prison. Go to the prison in the Western world. You find doctors if you want to need treatment. You find 3 meals every day. You have protection, and you are not bombed in the prison. But people in Gaza, even they are in prison and they are bombed also, and no foods, no medicine. Nobody is caring about them. You know, there is a conspiracy of silence about the situation in Gaza.
The issue is that what is taking place now is collective punishment. I think it is in breach of international law. I think that what took place in Castlead in late 2008-9 was outrageous because it didn't respect any of the fundamental principles of international law, which are that, first of all, the issue of distinction, that you draw a distinction between military and civilian people and military and civilian agencies and installations.
Okay, people often forget that there are nearly 1.3 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, nominal citizens of Israel, and they're there because in 1948, the war that established Israel on the Palestinian homeland, some Palestinians managed to remain inside the borders of Israel, and they were given citizenship. They weren't given citizenship as a kind of charitable act. They were given citizenship chiefly because Israel needed to mark out those Palestinians who were still within its borders to ensure that those who had been expelled or terrorized away would not be able to come back. The analogy I often use is a bit like branding cattle. Once you've branded people as Palestinian citizens of Israel, nobody else can claim to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel. You've demarked your Palestinian population inside the country.
I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. So over the last 43 years of occupation since 1967, Israel's demolished about 24,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territories. Now, in addition, again, they demolished thousands of more homes inside Israel of Palestinians and Bedouins, in other words, of Arab populations. And matter of fact, last year, in 2008, we'll take out Gaza for a minute, but in 2008, the Israeli government demolished 3 times more houses of Arabs who are Israeli citizens than they did of Palestinians in the occupied territories. It isn't an idea that there's an occupation that's temporary and we'll negotiate and Palestinians will get it back. No, the idea is that this is our country and therefore our control and is forever. This is a permanent, it's not just control, it's incorporation of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria into Israel proper.
Once you've got the settlements there, you control the territory, and once you control the territory, you can make life very difficult for the population groups around you. Palestinian villages are all around. They don't have access to water. They have hostile neighbours who are armed. Their only ability to reach their crops, their olive groves, their orange groves, whatever it is they're growing, is with the permission of the settlers. If the settlers start shooting, they can't go out and even gather their crops. And this has been also one of the features of the wall that Israel has built around the West Bank. It's tended to cut off these isolated rural Palestinian communities from their agricultural land. And once they're cut off from their agricultural land, they have no way of making a living.
UN statistic on the number of farmers who don't get permits in a lot of areas is 80% who formerly had land, worked the land. 80% do not get permits now to tend to their land. And there's an old Ottoman law that if the land is not worked for I think it's 3 years, then it transfers over to state land. So the Israelis use this to say, right, you haven't been working yet, it's now over to us.
So that increases the pressure to leave. And where they leave to is the larger cities. And what Israel has increasingly done is encourage Palestinians to migrate towards the cities. And then it's put those cities under Palestinian Authority control and said, okay, the Palestinians are ruling themselves. But what it's done is it's condensed the Palestinian population, concentrated it into very small areas, allowing it to control the land. Israel wants control of the whole of Jerusalem, and it's seeking control on every side. You know, people who aren't familiar with the geography of Jerusalem, it's difficult for them to understand quite how completely Israel is encircling the Al-Aqsa Mosque on all sides.
We're de-Arabizing it, which is half the process. You know, erasing the Arab presence, the Arab history, the Arab identity, the Arab character of the place, and Judaizing it, then making it Jewish. You see that taking place in the Silwan area, just below the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a Palestinian community that's being taken over by settlers in all kinds of ways, because how you take over Palestinian houses is a very dirty business. You know, it's extortion, it's using the courts, there's a lot of money involved, threats, blackmail. Now the city wants to demolish 88 houses in the center of this community to build a parking lot and archaeological garden for the city of David. In other words, the whole thing is to highlight the Israeli-Jewish connection to this part of Jerusalem.
If Palestine is to exist, if it's to have an economy, it needs a tourist industry, and Jerusalem is its tourist industry. If you take Jerusalem away, you take away the holy sites, you take away the economy, you take away the tourism. You leave the Palestinian state with nothing. And that's exactly what Israel wants. It wants a Palestinian state entirely dependent on Israel again.
Now, within the Jewish society, there's no equality. The Arab Jews were discriminated systematically for decades and decades. This didn't change yet. Still, we never had a non-European prime minister, for example. Never. Never had a president of the Supreme Court who was not a European Jew. Never.
There are 6 million Palestinian refugees around the world. It's the largest diaspora of all the different peoples, as the Palestinian people, who are not allowed to return to Palestine, while Israel is bringing in Jews from Russia and other parts of the world. Now, this is just unbelievable.
The Arab world is still watching the Palestinian fate in a very close eyes, very caring eyes, even though it's not translated many times into political language. As we know, politically, the Arab world did very little for the Palestinians. But it's one thing, the political, cynical world, and other thing is the popular sentiment.
انه كل هول اللي قتلوهم بغزة مؤخرا، هذا الليتست، انه شو اخوات شرموطة، حيوانات مثلا، حيوانات، حتى حيوانات ممنوع بالعالم تقصف حيوانات. عرفت مزبوط؟ انه اذا بيصير قصة لحيوان بيعملوا شكاوي وبتقوم جمعيات حقوق الانسان. اذا بدك تصور فيلم بدك تقول انه الحيوان من اذى، ما تخافوا من اذى الحيوان، ولا ممنوع تطلعوا للفيلم.
It is amazing that, you know, there are Christian Palestinians. 10% of the Palestinian population inside Israel is Christian, and they're fighting a struggle to stay there. The Palestinian Christian population has been declining for decades, ever since Israel was founded. And people say, well, that's because the Muslims are chasing them out or making life impossible for them. But I live in a Christian community inside Israel, and I see that's not the problem. That's not their key problem. Their key problem is that they live in a Jewish state which treats them as the enemy. But Israel, which says it wants to be this, you know, it's upholding some kind of Judeo-Christian tradition. What kind of Judeo-Christian tradition is it upholding if it's making life impossible for a large Christian population that has its roots going back 2,000 years to remain where those people have been living for so long and looking after the heritage and the traditions of the Christian community?
Strange, isn't it? The Christian church seems to be much more laid back than you'd expect. I don't hear the protests. I haven't seen the Pope marching through Bethlehem.
I found that cool.
Yeah, interesting.
Snipers, for example, in the Israeli army consider, I think, everybody over the age of 12 or 13 to be an adult. In other words, it's a legitimate target. When there's an intifada and you're shooting, snipers aim and kill a particular people, you can kill anybody over the age of 12 or 13. They're not protected as children. International law sees children as being under the age of 18. So from the Israeli point of view, it's under the age of 12 or 13.
Each year, 700 Palestinian children, on average, are detained by the Israelis, usually for offences no more serious than throwing stones at the Israeli forces of occupation. We know that many, if not most, of those children are tortured. In some cases, suffer sexual assault by the Israeli forces of occupation.
So the reason that Palestinians are separated from the Jewish population of Israel is not to use their labour in the way that Africans were separated off from whites in Bantustan. Rather, Palestinians are being separated in the process of ideally what Israel wants is to drive them out, to eliminate them, to get rid of them. So the kind of racism that's involved is entirely different. This is why when ANC delegations, people come from South Africa to go to the West Bank, invariably they come away saying, this is even worse than we had to suffer under apartheid.
In terms of what the general plan is, it's pretty simple. Break the Palestinian spirit, especially organize peaceful resistance, so that they cannot fight for their basic rights. How this is done? In as many ways as possible. From house demolitions to collective punishment, destruction of crops and agricultural land, illegal imprisonment and torture including children, checkpoints where youth could be made to kneel in the sun for hours, insulting and humiliating parents in front of their children, preventing mothers in labor from getting to hospitals resulting in infant death, illegal settlements, expulsions, expropriation of water, closure of borders and blocking of financial aid leading to collapsed economies and mass famine, use of civilians as human shields, attacks on hospitals, medical workers and ambulances, killing of aid workers and UN personnel, killing of journalists and photographers, mass killings, all while portraying the Palestinians as terrorists who are incapable of negotiating and implementing a peace treaty.
Israel has traditionally seen the West Bank and Gaza as laboratories for experimenting on human beings. They're a captive population, and it's easy for Israel to use the occupation as a way to experiment on how to control people, how to keep populations captive, how to keep them fragmented. We've seen that increasingly with Gaza and the West Bank as separate entities. Israel has developed that very much through a process of divide and rule, but in a very sophisticated new kind of form. And I think Israel also realizes that there's money to be made from this. I mean, and influence, particularly in America, because this whole technological control mechanism that it's developed can be exported, it can be used by other countries, particularly America, as we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan, using similar kinds of technologies, similar kinds of ways of thinking, similar attitude towards the Arab mentality, as it's called. It's Israelis who came up with this whole doctrine of the Arab mind and how to understand it, and how to destroy it and how to crush it. And the American military are reading these manuals that the Israelis developed decades ago. So this is something really a powerful, not only financial money-making exercise for Israel, but also gives it a position of influence, global influence, gives it power within Washington. So in all these ways, it's an incredibly important thing for Israel to have these occupied territories and use them, exploit them as laboratories.
As the late Golda Meir phrased it once, after the Holocaust, the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. And it took me some years to realize that it's all an outcome of an ongoing process, very systematic, of dehumanizing the Palestinians, which enabled the Israelis to feel good about themselves, to feel moral, to feel even Democrats. While when it comes to the Palestinians, they behave so differently. I can tell you with a deep conviction that almost any Israeli, will he be left or right or center, any Israeli does not treat the Palestinians as equal. If you scratch a little bit under the skin of any Israeli, you will find this feeling of superiority, this deep feeling that we are the chosen people, this deep feeling that the Palestinians are not human beings like us.
And the Israeli population thought that the occupation is good for Palestinians. They really believed that. And they believed that Israel created prosperity and brought civilization to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And when the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza started their intifada and demanded freedom and equality, the response in Israeli society was that these people are being ungrateful. So the response of the Israeli population, which was of course reflected immediately in the Israeli army, to the Palestinian resistance, because they felt the Palestinians are ungrateful, was just vicious violence and merciless punishment, because they felt that they must punish this ingratitude and used excessive power against Palestinians.
There is for sure no example in history in which the occupier victimizes himself like the Israelis. It's not only the occupier feels so good about what he is doing, he also thinks that he is not only the ultimate victim, but the only victim around. As the late Golda Meir phrased it in this horrible way, that we will never forgive the Arabs for what they forced us to become. I mean, it's their fault, the Arabs' fault, and we are the victims. This attitude is very typical to Israelis. Shoot and cry. Shooting and crying.
U.S. high-tech industry invests substantially in Israel, and it's increasing. Just take one example. Intel, the world's major chip producer, is developing what they claim will be the new generation of chips worldwide, much more advanced than current ones. That's all electronic equipment. And they're building the plant in Israel. It's an offshore, high-tech military base for the United States right on the periphery of the world's most strategically important region. That offers a lot.
Okay. But more importantly, perhaps, is today, and today is AIPAC and the Jewish community. I mean, I live in New York, where you find probably many very liberal Jewish, secular Jewish people who don't really involve, but when it comes to the crunch, they will support Israel. They don't think about Israel, they don't care. They'd never live in Israel if you paid them. But they at the end of the day, they remember the Jewish connection and the past and the story in the Old Testament and all those wonderful things, and they support Israel. But AIPAC has become such a powerful controlling device that every member of Congress worries about AIPAC.
Almost everybody in the West thinks we live in democracies. Rubbish! In my view, democracy exists nowhere in the world, and in some important respects, least of all in America, because there what passes for democracy is for sale to the highest bidder. Democracy cannot exist unless and until the people of nations, the citizens, the voters, are informed enough to take part in the decision-making process and call and hold their leaders to account.
I became aware just how close the European Union is to Israel, to the point that Israel is effectively a member state of the European Union. More recently, Cathy Ashton has recommended that Israel should be elevated to the status of a strategic partner for the European Union. She recommended this in the autumn that has just passed.
So even in Britain here, the idea is that you can arrest people that have committed war crimes. Well, after Gaza, certainly these are committed war crimes. So the political and military leaders of Israel come to Britain, and now that there's a threat that they can be arrested, the British government is going to change the law so that these war criminals cannot be arrested in Britain. Why? I mean, why? Where is that coming from? So in other words, Europe, to a large degree, but especially the United States, basically says to Israel, we'll protect you. You are not, don't fear sanctions for human rights for violations. Don't fear any kind of reprisals from the international community. We'll create this space for you.
Resolutions of the General Assembly are not binding on member states. They're voluntary, so to speak. Only public opinion or whatever would provide the pressure. And as you'll notice, the Americans have very cleverly steered every significant resolution on Israel came out of the General Assembly, not out of the Security Council. So the UN itself needs to be reformed. We can't continue to have a Security Council dominated by 5 member states, the so-called victors of the war, with a charter which was drafted by 3 charming gentlemen, Mr. Stalin, Mr. Roosevelt, and Mr. Churchill. 3 thugs, I would say, in terms of world dominance, control, and power, and military aggression, what have you. They designed the Charter, they designed the Security Council to maintain the control that they wanted, and they have succeeded. Nothing's changed since 1945. It's the double standard screws up the Security Council, the United Nations, the Brussels, everything we do, we have this double standard. And it's all perhaps left over from the colonial period where we treat the South differently, and we're still doing it, just different or more subtle or different forms of control and domination and exploitation of those who are weaker than we are.
Even absolutely clear black and white violations of international law, like shooting children, is something that Israel will not be criticized about, or certainly not sanctioned in the international forums.
There was a tremendous report into the British media a few years ago by Professor Greg Philo. Some of your viewers may be aware of him. He heads up a group at Glasgow University, a media research group. It has credibility throughout the world. And he and his group did a 2-year study of British TV's coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it came to some staggering conclusions. Not only was the British media's reporting very much biased in Israel's favour, it came to the conclusion that after 40 years of reporting, something like 90% of the listening and viewing audience had no idea what this conflict was really all about. Isn't that the most elegant tribute to what the media is not doing?
Usually when I watch TV, and my Western friends watch TV, they're used to Israelis speaking very good English with a strong American accent, and we rarely get Arabs who speak English well.
There's plenty of good spokespeople out there, men and women, who know the language and who can speak very rationally, but they're not selected by the media. The mainstream media goes after either the soft, moderate types who will say what the Western establishment expects them to say. Peace, 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 and no discussion about rights, international law, or justice. Or they'll get the, for lack of a better word, the idiots. Those who know nothing and say nothing of substance and just waste the airtime saying absolutely nothing. And they like them because they stereotype Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims with using those people. Either fanatic, crazy nuts who want to destroy and burn, and that's the image given.
And the categories were relatively simple. They were basically primarily all villains. I mean, that was the image. You know, they needed to shave, they needed the bath, they yelled, they screamed. They had no humanity at all, none whatsoever. There was never any reason for their action. They just appeared and killed people.
Oh, Jack Shaheen, yeah.
Yeah, he looked at over 1,000 movies, going back to the 100 years about how Arabs are vilified in the movies.
Look, you can go back to the Crusades. You know, this is European propaganda for as far back as you want to go.
Well, the colonizer always can only live with themselves rationally by distorting the image of the colonized.
So, I mean, the Arab world has its own non-violent heroes. And I must say, in going to Palestine for the last 10 years and going into some of the villages, Ramallah, Nailin, Bailin, I have seen many Gandhis there who are practicing non-violence.
People have, even me, I'm sometimes still amazed, people have no idea of how frightened not only governments are, but publishers are, and the media are, of offending Zionism.
And friends of mine like Cynthia McKinney has lost her seat twice as a Democrat because the opposition was financed by AIPAC to get rid of her because she's pro-Palestinian, for example.
So they'll intimidate you, and then if that doesn't work, they will isolate you. And if that doesn't work, they will incriminate you. They'll associate you with illegal activity.
So even the church is being bullied by Zionists?
Very much so. For example, I'll give you one example. 2 years ago, I lobbied along with colleagues to get the Church of England to sell its shares in Caterpillar bulldozers. Because Caterpillar bulldozers were being given by the American military to the Israeli army to demolish Palestinian homes. So it's not targeting Israel, it was simply saying it's our money, we're going to put it somewhere else. All hell broke loose. The archbishops of the Church of England had to justify their behaviour to the Israeli government. The chief rabbi in England, Jonathan Sacks, said it was evidence of a tsunami of anti-Semitism in the Church of England. Because we tried to sell our shares in Caterpillar, a tsunami, a giant wave of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism? We do know that the Israeli embassy summoned the archbishops to explain this action. Because you see...
Do they have a right to summon him?
No, but they do it anyway.
The most important tactic or way of shutting down any dissent is that they don't allow discussion. So at this event we organized in London, we had a speaker. We're in Parliament. We're in the House of Commons, right? And 2 members of Parliament, of the British Parliament, are facilitating or moderating or chairing the meeting. And they will not allow Hayo, an 85-year-old survivor of Auschwitz, to speak about his experience in Auschwitz and the lessons he takes from that. And these pro-Israel Zionist zealots are shouting him down, not even with logical arguments, not waiting until there's questions and asking a genuine question. They're just shouting, rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. A German-born Jew, and they're calling him anti-Semitic while he's giving an account of his experience of anti-Semitism. It was so deeply barbaric and inhumane that when the police finally escorted one of these disruptors out, he Heil Hitlered an Auschwitz survivor. It really exposes that it's really not about being interested in never again. And in fact, the Zionist Federation wrote in response to our organizing of this tour, never again for anyone. Organizing an event on Holocaust Memorial Day called Never Again for Anyone is anti-Semitic.
My car vandalized on many occasions, windows smashed, tires slashed, and my house pelted with literally hundreds and hundreds of eggs.
So we've got a Women of Color Rape Crisis Center. So a rape crisis center specifically for African American, Asian American, Latin American, Arab American, etc. Women. So in the United States, you've got a lot of voices against Arab and Muslim communities. You've got the Zionist ideology and prejudice. You've got Christian ideology and prejudice, and then you've got nationalistic, U.S. nationalistic imperialist ideology, and it all comes together on these communities. And so doing their job of being a community activist, they said these are the things that are contributing to violence in the Arab and Muslim communities where we live, and we are taking a stance against them. The Jewish Community Relations Council went to the city of San Francisco and insisted that their contract to provide rape crisis services is stopped until they remove their challenge to Zionism among a long list of things: racism, apartheid, Zionism, homophobia, sexism, until it was removed from the list. And they successfully, for 9 months, prevented this rape crisis center from getting the funding of their contract. And we spent 2 years organizing to not only get it back, but to maintain it for the next year.
I'm not sure enough people understand what's going on and how the Christian Zionists are meddling in the Middle East. And they're not meddling to make things good. They're not even meddling in a way to make things good for the Jews.
Their theological basis, their belief is that the Bible, Hebrew and Christian scriptures, teach that the Jews remain God's chosen people, separate, special. Because they're the chosen people, they're entitled to most of the Middle East, certainly the West Bank, Golan and Gaza. It's their land. They're being restored to the land. Jerusalem is going to be their capital, and the temple is going to be rebuilt. And there will be a war in the future with those who oppose Israel. Because of those beliefs, there's a very precise political agenda at work in Washington and wherever the Jewish lobby is working.
And is the key word here that they're trying to advance the end of the world?
They're trying to speed up the process. They want the end of the world to come quicker. And the only way to do that, in their beliefs, is to bring the Jews, all of the Jews from around the world, to Israel.
So let me get this. They want to advance the end of the world, bring all the Jews there for a combustion. While doing this, they're funding them and saying they like the Jews. And at the same time, with all this subtext, Israel takes money from them?
Yeah. There's something very cynical about the relationship going on here. Israeli Jews, certainly the politicians among them, understand this. They know that this is why the Christian Zionists are doing it, but they don't care. And they don't care for two reasons. One, there's a lot of money that goes to Israel because of it, and that's good for Israel. And the other thing is that the Christian Zionists are quite powerful in the American political system.
I think most regular folk not only do not understand this, it's just that it's too nuts for ordinary folk to actually get into it. So they don't, because it sounds crazy. I mean, as you talk, I find it very hard not to smile.
Yeah.
But
sure.
But if I'm to think of my friends or the general sane public who thinks this is actually nuts, to be blatant about things, there is one fundamental difference, is that those Christian Zionists are actually active, very powerful, and are influencing the world, while my friends and those who think that they're nuts are actually not active and allowing the world to continue to run without their involvement in it.
Well, this is always the problem. It's the crazy people. It's the people with fanatical views, with extremist views, who believe the end of the world is coming and that they need to be saved. These are going to be the people who are going to be the most active. These are going to be the people out there fundraising. These are the people who are going to be lobbying their congressmen.
The way we got our house in order was to be praying for this, for the end days, and you're rejoicing in something like this happening.
One of the things I found slightly disturbing, well, actually very disturbing, it's not slightly disturbing, is the view of the Jews. On the outset, they're saying that we like Jewish people, but we want more of them to go back to Palestine, or what is called Israel today, so that either they convert or burn.
Yes, yes.
That doesn't sound like love to me.
No, it isn't. Again, when you push that, when you really ask what it means to an individual, it's almost as if people aren't seeing others as individuals. They've got labels on, and they're being pushed in a direction. And so, when you put it bluntly, actually, Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic.
And part of their ideology is trying to create a war with Iran to advance the end of the world, and they're all for a nuclear showdown with Iran?
Well, this is the part of the problem with it. What does this entail? It doesn't just entail bringing the Jews to Israel. It also entails creating the conflagration. Maybe it wouldn't happen. Maybe you bring all the Jews there and nothing would happen. But that's not your end of times. Your end of times is conflagration. It's the end of the world. It's Armageddon. I mean, I live in Nazareth, only a few miles from Megiddo, which is the site of Armageddon. So it's kind of on my mind.
I mean, the Israelis try to put it into that vessel in order to heat up the fire, and because the last thing they want is peace.
And I think, and they were very clear, as Noor Masarha shows in his book, Expulsion of the Palestinians. They talked very openly in 1906, 1907, that they have two main objectives. One is to take over the whole of Palestine, and secondly, to get rid of the Palestinians who live in Palestine. They were very open about it.
Sammy, let's be perfectly clear. There has never been a peace process as such. It's always been a charade. But the point is, every time there is an apparent peace process, Israel just goes on expanding and expanding and expanding the settlements.
As they're talking, they're building settlements. It's very clever policy. This peace talks are just a game to divert attention from the construction and expansion and all the rest of it.
But I think you can simply highlight one of the main flaws of the whole approach of the peace process for almost 20 years. Well, number one, the idea of the United States as the quote-unquote honest broker, when of course the States is Israel's strongest ally, financially, militarily, diplomatically.
When I first started working on this film, I became aware that presenting all this dark material has the danger of inciting hatred, rather than evoking responsible action. And so I promised myself that I'd find a way to present this darkness compassionately and clearly, otherwise I myself would become a victim and fall contaminated. Ultimately though, I'm dealing with madness here. I have no other word for it, because it's making me mad. My head is so jumbled, I'm irritable, I've become to find it very difficult to concentrate on very basic tasks. Still, I look for inspiration. I ask myself, how did the black person try to convince the white American that racism contradicted the image the white person had of himself as educated, civilized, moral, that he really worshipped a compassionate God and called himself a Christian? How do civil societies break away from waiting for change to come from politicians and start dreaming that a system of apartheid such as South Africa, once seen as unshakable, could fall? How do people reach to each other across different cultures and countries and support each other?
And anyone who has hopes that change will come from within the Israeli society, I think, is living in a big illusion. This will not happen.
John Hagee, for example, he's pastor of a church in San Antonio, Texas, 20,000 members. He was the pastor to John McCain, presidential candidate. You know, he was a candidate against Obama. Hagee said Israel must join America. No, he said this. He said America must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran to fulfill Bible prophecy and speed the return of Christ. So he wants America to bomb Iran because it will bring Jesus back. And you think, I don't find that in the Bible. You know, would Jesus bomb people? I don't think so.
You know, and Jerusalem is built on layer after layer after layer after layer, with earthquakes and fires and destructions and rebuildings. So, you know, they're very porous layers. And then on top of that sits the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The idea is that if the settlers can dig underneath, open up the old sewage passages, open up other passages, weaken the layers upon which Al-Aqsa is built, then, now we live in an earthquake belt. Jerusalem is a part of the Rift Valley that goes from Syria all the way down to Lake Victoria. It's one of the major rifts in the Earth's crust. And there's a major earthquake at least once a century. We're actually overdue for a major quake. So the idea is, okay, we won't destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque, but we'll dig underneath, weaken the base, so that when the earthquake comes, it'll collapse. But once that happens, or something like that happens, the whole conflict becomes a theological conflict. Then it's really a clash of civilizations between Judaism and Islam, and then Christianity gets thrown in there somewhere. And that's where it gets out of control.
If there is a Palestinian state, it will be a series of tiny Bantustans based on the cities, with the rural land taken away, the water taken away, Jerusalem taken away, the holy sites taken away. And anything the Palestinians want, they will be entirely dependent on Israel. They want an economy, they're dependent on Israel. They want water, they're dependent on Israel. They want land to grow their crops, they're dependent on Israel. And once they're entirely dependent, Israel will have its way. It will dictate the terms as it does now under the occupation. It will just be a reinvention of the occupation, with Palestinian rulers looking like they're in charge.
But Sami, the question is whether slow death and uncertainty every day, whether you can give your kids something to eat, or whether your house will not be destroyed. That is also very, very, very bad. So, look, psychologically, I can't bring myself to not make the comparison. Because I see the parallels so clearly.
The world community is realizing more and more that what Israel is doing is a slow genocide of the Palestinian people.
The real problem is that the political and military elite of Israel feels that the world is turning against them. Now, regimes like the Israeli regime, it's very much like Muammar Gaddafi. What they do in such moments is not becoming more cooperative and more flexible. They become even fiercer. They become more brutal. Because they cannot think in any other way. So my greatest fear is that exactly because people like myself and you and others are succeeding in changing the Western public opinion about Israel. Exactly because of that, Israel is going into this dangerous phase where it says to itself, we have nothing to lose. We should use every weapon in order to create such facts on the ground that nobody could force us to go back on them. Even if they will accuse us of being barbaric, undemocratic, inhuman. Anyway, they're doing it, so what does it matter? We might do. That's my greatest worry. My greatest worry is that exactly because I think the world eventually is, and in the long term I'm optimistic, would force the Israelis to allow a much better regime and a much better life to develop in Israel and Palestine. This is the dangerous moment where they become even more brutal against the Palestinians. A similar thing happened in South Africa. The moment the world turned against apartheid South Africa was the horrible year when the South African regime committed the worst kinds of atrocities against the African people, which it had never done before. And then it fell. So we have to be all very alert and hopefully, as Marx said, history doesn't always repeat itself.
But you're still for boycott, of course.
Yeah, for sure.
Ever since I was a kid, I was being told you're this and not that. You're an Arab, not a Westerner. A Lebanese, not a Syrian. You're from this religion and not that one. I felt like I was being divided and squeezed into a smaller part of myself when I really didn't care for any of these associations. I remember the sense of openness I had as a child. As I grew older though, there were many times I had to work very hard at maintaining that sense of openness, especially when directly experiencing the atrocities of organized state violence. However, meeting people like the Auschwitz survivor Hejo Meir or Israeli-born Shur Haver and Ilan Pape have helped me regain some of my sense of wholeness. They're Jewish-born, saying, "Not in my name." And over the years, I've resisted seeing the Westerner as racist. Because all I have to do is look into myself, my immediate family and extended family, to see that racism exists in many forms. Some I would describe as beautiful souls caught up in innocent ignorance. Some hanging on to inherited tribal thinking. And some, well, maybe sociopath. Still, every person in this film has helped me redefine who my family is. When I see members of Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign stand in the rain while handing leaflets, I am humbled, and I feel like I felt when I was a kid. I belong to this world, and the world belongs to me. When I started making this film, I had no hope. I wouldn't have even dreamed of alluding to any solutions in the title of the film. However, the more interviews I did, the more I started meeting people who had very clear visions and working towards concrete solutions. While there may be different approaches, if I take a human rights perspective, then I summarize all of the history and current issues down to one word, and it's inequality. With that approach, a solution becomes very simple. It's equality. The question really is, how do you bring such a thing about? On a personal note, I have previously relegated my responsibilities to politicians while believing that there is nothing I can do that can make a difference. During the making of this film, it has been pointed out to me very clearly that there is no such thing as a peace process. Palestinians have been losing more of their land and all the human rights abuses since the inception of the peace process about 20 years ago. Successive Israeli governments have simply been expanding into Palestinian land. What has been pointed out to me is that once this is faced, that politics is the problem, then it becomes clear that solution can only come from civil society, which is us. If I can identify one common thread among all the different approaches, it's the belief in human rights and equality. And with that approach, it becomes an approach of challenging, like you would challenge any oppressive system, such as South Africa's apartheid or America's civil rights movement. You insist on equality and you keep on challenging the system until it can no longer do what it does. The rest of the film is about documenting the different approaches that are being taken.
New thinking means, as far as I'm concerned, only one thing: that the land of Palestine must not be partitioned, that Israel was a tragic and costly mistake, that the Jewish state, as constructed, is a state that is damaging and dangerous, not only to the Palestinians, but to the whole Arab region and to world peace. We're talking about a structure, we're talking about the Israeli government, we are not talking about the Israeli Jewish people. The Israeli Jewish people, as I tried to say before, who now live in that country, That is their home, and they must remain there if they wish to. But they will be joined by not just the Palestinian Arabs that are living there now, but all the ones and their descendants who were expelled in 1948 and 1967 and other expulsions. That's what should happen. If you were to ask me how on earth would you start to make a solution like this happen, the one-state solution, which I'm saying is the only fair solution for this, well, my answer is you have to have action against the Israeli state. It's not going to come from European governments, it's not going to come from the United States, that's obvious. Therefore, it must come from people, from civil society. The really effective action that civil society can adopt and can develop is boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
So it's very painful when you know a friend who has been shot, a friend whose mother was stopped at a checkpoint and had to give birth at a checkpoint. These are not things we read in papers. These are things that are real. We live with them. Despite that, it's extremely important for us to channel this anger, this emotion, into rational, moral argument. Why this has to end. And this is precisely why we've called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, against Israel, because it's based on international law, human rights. Yes, it's a punitive, very effective punitive measure against Israel, against its institutions, against companies profiting from Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. And because it is rational and morally consistent, it is extremely threatening to Israel. What exactly are we threatening here? We're threatening Israel's oppression, apartheid. Yes, at the end of the BDS campaign, Israel will no longer be a colonial state, nor an apartheid state, nor a state that denies our refugees the right to return. That's what we are delegitimizing, Israel's oppression, racism, and apartheid. And they know that this is very threatening, because you're appealing to a very wide community, as you've seen here in Ireland, in the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, all the major unions in this country. So you're getting a mainstream public supporting BDS against Israel. They see this as something civil, effective, that everyone can do. From boycotting Israeli goods in the supermarket, to boycotting Israeli academic institutions, not going to conferences in Israel, pressuring Irish singers like Bono, U2, and other performers not to go to Israel, not to be complicit in whitewashing Israeli crimes, to pressuring Irish companies like CRH, the cement company, not to continue being complicit in war crimes, building Israel's apartheid wall and settlements, colonial settlements. All this is something that people can do.
BDS is an instrument to be used by civil society, and the only reason civil society has to use it is because governments refuse to take their responsibilities. Now, in the case of the European Union, the association agreement with Israel that gives it extraordinary trading privileges has an Article 2 that calls for it to be suspended in the case of violations of human rights on either side. Civil society is obliged to impose its own sanctions, so to speak, in the shape of boycott, and to say to governments, look, you don't like this, you don't like our boycotting Israel, there's one way to stop us, and that is by taking the action that you yourselves have the power to take to make Israel conform to international law.
They were the one that started the boycott. Israel has been boycotting the Palestinians in every form for more than 60 years, and now they're saying you shouldn't boycott Israel. Okay, stop boycotting, Palestinian academics, Palestinian, representatives, politicians, and then maybe we'll stop boycotting you. But they're very scared of the boycott, I think. Yeah.
Western mainstream media tend to portray the Palestinian-Israeli issues as being very complex, while regularly entertaining a whole range of deflecting arguments. However, if you start looking closely at the arguments discussed, you start noticing some very obvious patterns emerging. Now, if you take just a little bit of time and start making your own calculations, you'll end up with one very simple fact. For more than 70 years, Israel has been demolishing Palestinian houses and rebuilding in their place, expanding into Palestinian land, and it continues to do so. This is not an opinion or a subjective statement, but a simple fact, as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. All arguments end up being a deflection of this simple truth.
We can have no civilization without the rule of law. That is the most important element in our living together on this planet. Israel flouts the rule of law. It goes against the wishes of the United Nations. It breaks the Geneva Convention. We have to uphold international law. And that's all we need to say.
أنا مهمتي بأوروبا إنه ضلني دق على ذاكرته لهيدا الأوروبي لهيدا الغربي. أنت خلقت إسرائيل، أنت اللي عملت هيدا القانون الدولي، يا بتلغيه كليا أو بتحاول وبتسعى لتحقيقه بكل الأساليب يعني.
The actions of Zionism and Zionist people, that is not what Judaism is all about. And they have no right in any way to say that they are chosen, because they have falsified the Jewish religion.
Despite the cynical popularity that exists in our world today, where people simply satisfy themselves by saying the world has always been this way, the conflict in Israel and Palestine is a religious one, these are lies, effectively. The reason why we have any freedom in this world today is because people, beautiful people, against all odds, throughout the ages, have stood up time and time and time again, oftentimes being brutalized, being imprisoned, having their families brutalized or killed, or themselves losing their lives. People, most of whose names we'll never read, that aren't in the history books, who stood up, common, everyday people.
My name is Frank Barrett, and I'm the coordinator of the Russell Tribunal in Palestine. We are showing the complicities of the third states, and without this active support, we want to show that Israel won't be able to do what it does and keep bombing the hell of the Palestinians. Investigating third parties, so other countries, other bodies like the UN, other bodies as well like corporations that are actually enabling Israel to commit war crime. So all those countries that always say, oh, we're peaceful, we're neutral, they're actually not.
Watching the images of occupied Palestine on the television, that I felt a personal responsibility to be there. So I traveled to the West Bank in 2001 and lived in Jenin refugee camp for about a year and a half, and then Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, and then was eventually deported, lived in Baghdad for a year, and then working with Palestinian refugees, and then working with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon for 2.5 years, and now the last year in Gaza.
I argue that resistance is more. It's a psychological, it's a cultural, not just a political. It's something that is much larger than that. It has all sorts of, if you like, elements to resistance. It's about building self-esteem. It's about rebuilding a psyche. It's about rebuilding a community.
And so if you work as a resistance movement, or musically, let's say, it's one, yeah, you'll feel that you're always pushing against something. But maybe if you just leave one branch out there, then the rest can grow and it's not pushing against anything. And that's the trick, that's the balancing trick, so that your music isn't tainted by being repressed or fighting repression. You want to make your music or your culture or poetry or art or anything you're at untainted. That's the achievement. Because if you make your music as a deliberate push against, then in effect you're acknowledging your opponent's strength. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Because your opponent has affected your development. You know? So that's why I mean it's a kind of a balancing trick. Like a real martial artist would look over there when he's beating you up. You know, he'd look over there and he'd buff, so that he's totally unaffected by you. Do you understand? Yeah. So culturally, that's what you need to do. You can't let them affect you that much. You know what I mean? Otherwise, you get more thorns than roses. You know.
In the past 30 years or so that I've been watching documentaries, when I get to the credits at the end, I'm left with the impression that documentary making belongs to a group of trained professionals out there and elites, and it's something that me or most people couldn't do. Well, I'm going to demystify the whole process for you. When I say I have no experience in filmmaking, it means that I got a camera, I asked my friend Paddy in Tower Records, and he says put the head not in the middle but on the side of the screen. So that's the extent of my camera work training. Beyond that, I bought a camera from Cons across the road. I still haven't read the manual. When something goes wrong, Bob helps me out. So that's the extent of my technical knowledge. I have no agent. I simply requested interviews and I got them. I would walk around with cameras and tripods on my own. No light or sound, just whatever the camera is giving me. And I had no structure when I started making the film. It was only a year into it that I started thinking, how do I organize this? The editing happened with a friend of mine who is only beginning to get into the business now, and the animation with a second-year student. So if I can do it, anybody can. Put it up on the internet, bypass mainstream media, and we're talking to each other like we are right now, one-to-one.
شو بتحب توجه رسالة للعرب اللي إجمالا اللي مثلا في عندي كتير رفقة وأنا منهم كنت حاسس إنه ما في شيء فيني أحكي حيعمل فرق.
أوكي.
يعني مهزوم من جوا.
هاي نقطة كتير مهمة لأنه تعودنا بالجمهور العربي اللي ما يسمى بالشارع العربي إنه نعبر عن تضامن مع فلسطين سواء من المغرب لمصر للبنان للبحرين. التضامن مع فلسطين أو اليمن بمظاهرات ضخمة وأعلام فلسطينية كبيرة وحرق علم أمريكا وعلم إسرائيل والموت لهاي والموت لهديك وافتحوا باب الجهاد، وكله تنفيس وتنفيس وتنفيس وفيش إشي عملي. اللي عم نطرحه في حملة المقاطعة إنه في إشي عملي تعملوا، في كتير أشياء عملية تعملوا. مش معقول شركة زي فيوليا الفرنسية عم بتساهم في تهويد القدس، في بناء السكة الحديد، القطار الخفيف بسموه، بربط المستعمرات الإسرائيلية مع مدينة القدس، في نفس الوقت اللي شركة فيوليا الفرنسية عم تربح هذا العقد مع إسرائيل لتهويد القدس، تربح عقود في السعودية لربط مكة والمدينة، أو تربح عقود في البحرين أو الإمارات أو مصر أو المغرب. إشي ممكن الجمهور العربي يعمله في هاي البلاد إنه يبدأوا حملات ضد إدخال هاي الشركة لبلادهم. إنه إحنا سنقاطع القطارات اللي فيوليا بتمشيها على سبيل المثال، سنقاطع الشركة الأيرلندية للإسمنت اللي عم تبني الجدار الفصل العنصري في فلسطين المحتلة، رح نعمل حملة كبيرة ضد المسؤول الفلاني أو الفنان الفلاني اللي عم بيعمل تطبيع، علاقات تطبيع مع إسرائيل، وكأنه العلاقة طبيعية بينه وبين إسرائيل مع وجود الاحتلال والاستعمار والحرمان اللاجئين من حقهم في العودة. فكتير مهم نحول هذا الغضب لإشي عملي. حملات campaigns بالإنجليزي، المشاريع قابلة لتنفيذ هدف معين والتخطيط للوصول لهذا الهدف. التنفيذ مش كافي.
Very few American, Arab, and Muslim American filmmakers defining themselves, and so if they don't define themselves, who defines? Who defines the American Arab, the American Muslim, the Arab, the Muslim? Someone else defines them. A lack of presence, I think, plays a key role. Plays a very, very key role. There just needs to, presence propagates power, and we need more image makers. I'm an optimist when it comes to the future because, one, there are young filmmakers, Arab Americans and Muslim Americans out there making feature films now. You look what Sony did. I mean, the Japanese, when they bought their company, you don't see many films under the banner of Sony that vilify Asians, do you? They make money. They make money, those films, but they don't vilify Asians. And that has a lot to do with who owns the studio.
If people like me and Hwcstpip and Hayomaya and others you've interviewed, if we were assisted to take this message of truth to America, I believe it would be possible to change.
But to me, the problem is if you really use victimhood to progress yourself, you're not going to be anything but a victim, because that's what you declare yourself to the world to be, and that becomes your righteous justification. So you need to stop that.
You see, we're caught in a condition that is about materialism and the world and territory. And those are ours. This is mine. This is not yours. This is ours.
I think that we are in a new era now as the human family. We're interconnected. We're interdependent within the world today. We have to move beyond tribalisms, beyond nationalisms, beyond religious labels and tags. We have to move to a new place as the human family, and we have to create a consciousness of non-killing and non-violence.
One quality I did not inherit from my family in relation to the Palestinian issue is any sense of hope. I was born into defeat as an Arab, a feeling confirmed on a daily basis since childhood by the political reality out there. When I first started making this film, I still had no hope. I began the film against this feeling, and it wasn't until I met some of the people I've interviewed, being touched by their visions and commitment to their work, that I started to come a bit more alive. And then, the Egyptian Revolution happened. It's very clear to me now that prior to the Egyptian Revolution, Arabs didn't even allow themselves to dream. Irrespective of where it goes, the Egyptian Revolution is not just about the collapse of a dictator, but the fall of a system so heavily supported by the US, where a whole nation is pressurized into silence as Israel commits its atrocities against their Palestinian neighbors. I've come to see the loss of hope and this institutionalized feeling of there is nothing I can do that could make a difference as being the biggest threat to cultures across the whole globe. Personally, I feel I need to keep on renewing my sense of hope because simply I cannot afford to go back to how I used to be. One way of keeping a sense of hope alive is by staying connected with inspiring people and their work, and hopefully I've been able to share with you that there are plenty in this world. As to the sense of defeat I grew up with, if I look at Palestinians as a people with all that they have been enduring from Israel and the rest of the world for more than 70 years now, well, they're still here. I've come across a phrase recently, resistance through existence.
يعني مثل كل فلسطيني حكي معه وعاملة معه مقابلة ولو كان عمره 90 سنة بيقول لي لو ما أنا رحت بده يروح ابني أو ابن ابني أو ابن ابن ابني بدها ترجع أرضنا، لك الأمل لوين؟ وبالنسبة إلهم راجعين مش هلأ بكرة بعد بكرة، في يوم راجعين فيه وبينطروا ما عندهم مشكلة.
Feeling-wise, I was under the impression there is nothing in the near future that can show the West what they have done to the Muslim and Arabic world.
It depends how near is the near future.
Well, put it this way: I did not allow myself to dream about it.
Right.
Which is the definition of hopelessness, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Well, we have to allow ourselves to dream. A lot of the propaganda directed against us is designed precisely to create that feeling of hopelessness. And so we cannot give in to that. That's so important. There are these learned helplessness experiments that show that when you put these rats in a cage and you make it clear to them that no matter what they do, they're going to keep getting tortured, then eventually the rat turns to a blob of furry jelly and it can't get up off the floor of the cage anymore. And even if you stop shocking it, it still just lies there hopeless. And that's what they're trying to do to us with this propaganda. There's a psychological war against Muslims, Arabs, and especially Palestinians, I think. And they want us to feel that hopelessness. And they've succeeded to some extent, but they haven't put out the last spark of hope. And as long as there's one spark of hope, it can spread and it can ignite other people. Once it builds up to a certain point, things can suddenly start changing quite rapidly. And we have free media and the internet still. They're going to have a hard time shutting down the internet. If they shut down the internet, they shut down the economy. And as long as we can be telling the truth in a way that reaches a lot of people, there's no telling what could happen.
I feel like getting up and hugging you, man.
Well, thank you, Sammy.
عندك أمل.
اسمي أمل. أنا اسمي أمل.
بتحسي بالأمل؟
جدا. قد ما موتوه فينا بضل بيموت وبرجع بيموت وبرجع. كيف برجع؟ برجع من ترباية الأهل. بندفع يوم بيوم على إنه طلعوا قدامكم على التلفزيون بموت 100 شهيد بالنهار 100 بس برجعوا هدول 100 بجيبوا كمان 100 قدهم حتى يكملوا لقدام. بعلمونا من احنا وصغار فقدنا هذا الحدا بس هذا الحدا ما تركنا جسدا بس تركنا الروح، تركنا الكتب، تركنا الافكار، تركنا التجربه. كل هاي الشغلات من كل الجوانب يوم بيوم بفلسطين بتعلمها، كان من امي، كان من ابوي، كان من اصدقائي، كان من الاساتذه او من المعلمات عندي بالجامعه. فكل هذا يوم عن يوم يوم عن يوم بزيد البذره انه بدنا نكمل وبدنا نوصل. قد ما انتصينا بدنا نوصل.